This story time is a bit different because it's not necessarily about the prison or judicial system. It's about my mother and why I choose spirituality over religion. And y'all know how I feel about my mother. Now, I don't have an issue with people who choose religion over spirituality, but it's just not for me. I grew up going to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and sometimes on Saturday. And a personal lesson that I've learned from growing up around so-called Christians is that it's no hate quite like Christian love. One thing I didn't disclose about my parents when I did a story time on them is that my mother became a minister over the years. She was truly dedicated to that position. I mean, she had a true servant's heart. I vividly remember not long before my mother transitioned that she was discharged from the hospital on a Saturday evening and she was back in this pastor's pulpit for him on Sunday morning. It's mid-August 2020 and my mother's having some respiratory issues. Of course, she goes to her doctor. They tell her that she's fine. They send her home, but my father said the condition wasn't getting any better, so he made her go to the ER. During this time is the height of COVID, so the medical staff tells my father that he cannot come back. They were going to test her for COVID. If she tested negative, then he can come back with her. Unfortunately, she tested positive for COVID, so she was hospitalized from late August 2020 up until she transitioned September the 19th of 2020. During this time, my mother's dusty-ass pastor was well aware that she was in a hospital dealing with COVID complications. Not one time did he call and check on her nor check on my father. Not to mention that he was a respiratory therapist at the same hospital that my mother was hospitalized at. Now, later on, word on the street was that he had already retired and he was no longer working there. But either way, you couldn't call my mother and check on her, not even pray with her on the phone. Nothing. Use your connections at the hospital to get a visit in with her. Like absolutely nothing. If you didn't want to call my mother directly, why not call my father to check on the condition of my mother, to see if there's anything that my father needed, to see if there's anything that my mother needed, or anything that you can do as the pastor? It's not like this pastor has a huge congregation like TD Jakes or anything like that. Like, sir, you probably got all the 22 members of the church and 16 of them probably came with my mother to fill in your seats. I play about a lot of things, but my mother will never be one. I don't care who you are. I don't care what position you hold. I don't care what position I hold. At the end of the day, when it comes down to her, anybody age 2 to 92 can get it when it comes down to her. My mother's birthday is September the 8th. Of course, she spent it in the hospital. I called, tell her happy birthday, etc., etc. September the 9th comes and she's just like, listen, Peaches, this is what I need you to do if I don't make it home. I'm like, Mom, stop talking like that. I don't want to hear that. You're going to make it through. You're going to pull through like you always do. Like you are OG. You strong. You got this. And she was like, no, Peaches, I really need you to listen and follow these instructions. Now, my mother was always a very prepared person. So she gave me instructions on my father, finances, what funeral home to use, what she wanted to be dressed in, where the life insurance policies was, etc., etc. Needless to say, my mother didn't make it home. She transitioned. And now this is where the bum ass pastor comes into play. So now we're at the funeral home making the funeral arrangements. And the funeral home director says, do you all have your own church to use? Would you like to use the chapel here? Or do I need to make arrangements for you all to rent a church? So my family and I tell him we already have a church that we're going to use. My mother was a minister, and him assuming that the pastor had already reached out to us, he wanted to know what times they had available for the services. Now, mind you, the pastor still has not reached out, and he know that my mom has already transitioned. He reached out to a family friend and told her to let us know that if we need him to just call him. So my sister's like, we're not reaching out to him for nothing. He needs to be contacting us. We don't need to be contacting him. But anyways, the funeral home director wants this information and we give it to him. He realized that he's familiar with where the church is located and he doesn't know the pastor personally, but he does know of him. So he go ahead and call him on speakerphone while we're there making the arrangements. This bum bitch tells the funeral home director that he did not want to have the services at his church because my mother died from COVID and he was within the age bracket and he did not want to catch it. So not only am I trying to keep my cool, but I'm trying not to snatch the phone out of the funeral home director's hand because it's not even my phone. So the funeral home director explains to him, he was just like, listen, Pastor, staff and I have been very well trained on how to handle the body dealing with COVID. All the precautions will be taken. You and nobody else will be able to catch COVID and her body is going to be embalmed as well. There's going to be no way for you or anybody else to catch COVID. So that wasn't good enough. He went from that to, well, if we have the services, only 50 people are going to be allowed in the church and that includes myself. I get it. I get that regulations were in place for certain things, but we were not going to have the services inside of the church. We were having the services outside of the church. Reason being, not only was she very well known in her community and people wanted to pay their respects, but there were also people that was planning to come from out of town. And I just feel like out of respect for her and the impact that she had on other people's lives, it was only right for everybody to be able to come and pay their respects for her, even if they had to sit in their car during the services. Well, this bum was still carrying on about how he didn't want to catch COVID. After he was already told that he didn't have to worry about catching COVID, he came up with every excuse under the sun. Now, let me put y'all on to something if you didn't know. You know how they have the treasurer at church and they keep account on who's paying tithes and offering, how much they're paying each week at church? Well, in the event that you want to leave the church, they have to give you all that tithes and offering back. Now, when I first got to the funeral home director told me he was going to educate me on how this goes. And I think he mentioned that because when we first came there, my sister and I told him that we were both in the process of getting our broker's license. Actually, I think that she had got hers and I was in the process of getting mine. And baby, why did he teach me that little tip? I told the funeral home director, call his bum ass back. I said, look, either you're going to allow us to have my mother's services at your church or all of her tithes and offering, we want it back. Now, it's just my personal opinion that church is a business and these pastors, they don't want to have to give their money back. So needless to say, we had my mother's funeral services at the church. I was very specific as to who was supposed to speak at my mother's funeral, right? Nobody was supposed to deviate away from the program. So while we at the services, a lady gets up to read a scripture. Mind you, this is a lady who does not like my mother. It is well known. Everybody knows this lady doesn't like my mother. The pastor knows this lady doesn't like my mother. So why is she getting up to read a scripture? In the middle of the services, I got right up on out of my seat, went right over there to that funeral home director, and I was just like, yo, why is she up there reading the Bible scripture when we already have somebody on the program for that? He was clueless as well. So he goes over there to the pastor and asks the pastor, why is the lady up there reading the Bible scripture? And the pastor is just like, oh, I apologize, I didn't know. Not only that, but he didn't give anybody in the community an opportunity to speak on my mother's behalf. Like, he did not open the floor up for them to be able to get up there and say something. So now I'm really fuming. Boiling on the inside, right? But I'm trying to keep my composure because my mother raised us with so much class. You know, I know it's a time and place for everything, and you can correct it, but there's a way to do it, and I was ready. Now the services are over, but my mother's funeral is so crowded. I can't remember who all was there, but I can remember the few people that should have been there that wasn't. So I'm trying to get through the crowd. So I give my favorite uncle on my father's side the look, and he already know what time it is because he knows what's going on, right? And he's the type of person that when he turn up, he's going to make the front page of the newspaper every time. So my uncle is always already set. So he's ready to go. He's just like, look, you want me to go ahead and handle him now? And I'm just like, no, chill for a second. I need to have my words with him. So I go up to him and I'm like, look, the first thing you did to rub me and my family wrong, you never called not one time to check on my mother. You never called my father. You never called any of us as a pastor. And then you didn't want to have my mother's services here after she's been in your pulpit for how many years serving the people? Not to mention, she always paid her tithes and offering. That was one thing about her. She was going to give that 10% plus more. She was not missing that. You have somebody speaking on her behalf that you know do not like her. He tried to deny saying that he didn't know that, but he did, because one time my mother pulled him and that lady back there to have a conversation. Now he's trying to explain himself. You know what I'm saying? Save face. But you can't do that because I've already heard what you said on speakerphone, and the funeral home director would have had no reason to lie on you. I don't want to incriminate myself, so I'm not going to say everything that I said to him, just in case anything ever happened in the future. They're not going to put it off on me. When my uncle got finished with him, he had a crystal clear understanding not to play with this family. I also told that bum-ass excuse of a pastor that he should have been honored to have my mother's services at that church. And he didn't have to worry because I never planned on stepping foot back on that property again. Needless to say, I probably should have never said never, because less than 4 months later, we was back at that same church having services for my 19-year-old niece. But I will say this, the next go round, we had absolutely no problems with him. He already knew what time it was, right? He couldn't even look me in my face. Now, granted, this story time about this incident was requested, but I said all of that to say this: be mindful of who you have as your pastor. This incident with my mother only solidified my decision to choose spirituality over religion. Like I said, I don't have anything against anybody who chooses religion, but I do know that it's a business. Some of these pastors are so money hungry and their heads become so big that they seem to forget that the whole purpose of being a pastor is to serve the people.